this is how I named this lecture, Learning Geometry. And forget a little bit. And in learning geometry, what we are trying to do is somehow look at manifolds and treat them as metric spaces. And in a moment, I will tell you exactly what I mean by that. So let me just close the door. I think that we talked about it at the beginning of the course, but let me repeat it. When we take an image, and all we do is take a pixel to a pixel, or a pixel with some statistical knowledge about the neighboring pixels, then this is called image processing, okay? Now, if we are trying to understand the geometry or infer the context of what is going on in the image, this is called computer vision. I mean, this was the classical way of defining that. And when you are taking geometric structures and you are trying to present a nice looking image, this is called computer graphics. So the inverse problem of computer vision is called computer graphics. And recently there have been some newcomers to the game. For example, Pokemon Go is the augmented reality. You take some geometric structure and you place it in the real world, and this is called augmented reality. Or you take something from the real world and you embed it into the virtual world, and this is called virtual reality. And I mean, even yourself, for example, you can put yourself in the virtual world, and this is called virtual reality. And about 2 decades ago, even more, when I came to the Technion, they told me, look, computer vision is the most complicated problem. In order to, I mean, if you solve that, you have reached the Olympus, and you are, you can be declared as being part of the gods. And the most complicated problem in computer vision is segmentation. Looking at this image, for example, if you know how to segment the fence and the houses and the lighthouse, then you've done your share in that. Let me tell you that 2.5 decades later, these problems are more or less solved. I mean, they are very efficient solutions, and these are sort of brute force solutions. If we think of neural networks, then neural networks, in my perspective, in a sense, is a very efficient way of having a lookup table. Something that would look at the structure of images and knowing somehow coding all the observed structures that it observed before, it knows how to take the fence apart from the lighthouse and from the houses, and even name them, if you will. So this problem is more or less solved. But there are many other problems that cannot be solved. Now, it is solved because there is this really nice property that by now you should all be familiar with, and this is convolution. If I just feed this image into a neural network, then each and every patch in the image goes through a convolution. I mean, I'm actually convolving the whole image with the same patch, and this is how I use the redundancy, the fact that the same filter that is operating here should operate there, at least at the beginning of the network. And this is how I can manage processing 1,000 by 1,000 image, I mean 1 million pixels, and still optimize for just a countable number of neurons, which basically code how I do the convolution on this image. So this is how CNN, or convolutional neural network, came about. So if we look at the 3 people that got the Turing Award 2 years ago, Yann LeCun, Geoff Hinton, and Joshua Bengio, basically what they did is look at an image and apply a set of convolutions on this image. So each of these plates is basically convolving the image with a different plate, and then somehow subsample it, and then adding more convolution and subsampling, and at the end, when you get just a finite small number of numbers, then you can do something which is called fully connected network. I mean, you can connect each and every output to each and every to the next layer, and this is where you can actually apply a fully connected network. So when you have a small number of coefficients, you can apply fully connected network. But before that, in order to extract the features, you need to train something, and this training is usually defined by convolution. So this is true for the ImageNet, and it is also called. It is also true for the AlexNet and whatever you like. So all these architectures are basically involved convolution and then some way of shrinking the data, either subsampling or max pooling, but this is how it goes. And this whole machinery basically created a revolution in the whole way that we process images, okay? So this is called the neural network era. And let me show you 2 examples very subjective ones from my group of processing such images. And this is a joint work with now he's Dr. Gil Shammai, a PhD student Ron Slosberg, medical Dr. Yoav Binnenbaum, another medical Dr. Irit. Ziv Gil was the head of the neck and surgery and Af Ozen Garon in Rambam. And what we did is the following. We took samples from breast cancer. So when you take, when you're diagnosed with something weird in your breast, usually the physician is taking a needle and try to extract part of this tissue out of the breast. And then what happens is that the tissue is handed over to a pathologist, and the pathologist is coloring, is painting this part of a tissue with something which is called hematoxylin and eosin. Okay, it colors the shape of the tissue and the cells. You can see roughly what is going on in the tissue. And then pathologists are looking, the expertise of pathologists is to look at this kind of images and tell you, look, you have or you don't have cancer, and what is the grade of this cancer. Now, in order to treat this cancer, you also need to know what are the hormonal receptors, what is the characteristics of this cancer. In order to do so, you usually color the tissue with a different kind of coloring, which is much more expensive and takes a little bit more time. And this is called immunohistochemistry staining. And then it shines up the cells. If, for example, the cancer is estrogen positive, then you'll get these brown cells that you see over here. And if it's estrogen negative, then you get nothing, okay? So then when the physician is looking at these guys, he knows how to treat or how to direct the oncologist to treat the patient in the proper way. Now, from here to here, it takes about 2 weeks for the whole process of the coloring, etc. And some countries don't even have immunohistochemistry. The question that Gil asked, that we ask ourselves, is can we look at this image, at the H&E image, and infer and come to the conclusion that we would have been able to do by looking at the immunohistochemistry coloring. So what we did is use classical, in some sense. I mean, there are a lot of tweaks and tricks over there, but we use classical neural networks. And surprise, surprise, we got really good results. In fact, we can show that for 30% of the patients, we can do better than even after you color it with specific immunohistochemistry coloring. So this is a result that we had about 1.5 years ago, and now we're trying to push it forward. So we can see beyond what pathologists are seeing here. And the reason is that a network can actually look at really strange combination of the tissue and how it is shapes that pathologists are not there yet. Okay, so a network can actually do far and beyond human observer. And in fact, even in regular images, if you train your image to classify objects, the networks in the last 2 years actually can classify objects in images better than human, which is a big surprise. But again, think about it as a lookup table, which takes care of all the variations that it is exposed to. Okay, it made us famous for a while, and now we are trying to push it forward and tackle new problems. And if you'd like, you can talk to Gil Shammai. He's leading this effort in my group. Another way of using classical convolutional neural network is, for example, to decipher expressions. So a little bit about expressions. If we look at how muscles are reacting, in fact, the first electrophysiology, the fact that electric currents are actually those that are activating our muscles, was explored, I would say, about 300 years ago. And people actually realized these are the first photographs of injecting current into faces and seeing what is going on. People realized that there are about 50 groups of muscles in the face, and combinations of these muscles create different expressions. Now, psychologists approach the problem of expressions from a completely different perspective. They ask the following: would the same expression always express the same thing. So if, for example, I land in the middle of the Amazonas and I talk to a tribe, would smiling always reflect happiness? Would anger always reflect with the same expression, etc., etc.? And it appears to be that this is indeed so. I mean, if you look, whenever somebody is happy, a person and even a monkey, they would always smile. Okay, so smiling means happiness. And what Paul Ekman, psychologist who was operating in this field about 50 years ago, and I think even until now, realized is that you can define something which is called action unit. So if you assign the effect of each group of muscle on the face and you call it an action unit, then you have a vocabulary of 50 letters. And with these 50 letters, you can define what is a smile, what is anger. And in fact, he showed that, and again, he showed that it is uniform, it is universal through all populations in all places. And he defined 7 of these, in fact, 8 of these expressions. There is also neutral: joy, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, contempt, and surprise. And he trained experts to classify these kind of expressions. Okay, and there was also a Disney film that was trying to capture this kind of idea by playing with the creatures in the brain of a teenage girl. Okay, so the question is, how can we use this fact in order to read expressions, to train a network, a neural network, to read expressions? So there are these experts that can classify each and every face into these 7 kind of universal expressions. And these are databases that exist. And what we try to do is use that in order to understand what the network is actually learning. I mean, how would the deep structure of the network, where can I find these 50 groups of muscles in the network? Okay, so this is how the action units of Ekman look like: inner brow raiser, outer brow raiser, etc., etc. I mean, you have lip corner puller, which happens when you do with your lips like that, chin raiser, etc., etc. And there are about 50 of them, 48 if you will. So we know that this is how psychologists are looking at this problem. And we know that there are, at least from a medical point of view, there are 50 groups of muscles. So there is some relation between the two. And the question would be, what would happen when we feed the network a bunch of tens of thousands of faces, each one classified as one of the 7 core expressions, universal expressions. And this is what we did. This is a combination of action unit 24, action unit 70, 17, etc., etc. Okay, so you can see how these action units are affecting a specific posture, a specific expression. So a student of mine, Ran Brower, was working on this problem. And again, his problem was to understand what the deep network is doing. Now let me give you a teaser, a spoiler. At the end of the day, he did. And when you understand what the network is doing, you can actually improve the network and work on the most delicate problem of reading expressions. And this is, for example, detecting lies. So Ekman, the psychologist, claimed that when you're telling a lie, there is an uncontrolled micro emotion that escapes you. For example, if you'll search for Clinton, I never had sex with this woman, and you will look at the video, you will see that the inner brow is jumping by about half a centimeter when he's saying, I never had sex with this woman. Okay, so it goes like that. So according to Ekman, this is a proof that he was lying. And the question was, can we actually capture these micro emotions? I mean, this is what we did at the end. And we, at the time, 3 years ago, we were the first in the world. Afterwards, I think that other people also entered the game. And obviously, when you train with a lot of data, you can beat anything. But if you now peel off the layer of the network and you go one layer before the fully connected one that classifies the expression, what you would see is that these are the actions, it's called receptive fields, activation fields of the last layer of the neurons. And if you would look at them, they go almost exactly as the action units of Ekman, okay? So there is almost, and you can prove it statistically, obviously, so there is almost one-to-one relation between these 50 action of the neurons at the last layer of the network and these action units that Ekman defined. Now, for me, it was a little bit of surprise because I expected the last layer to be some combination of these action units, but not necessarily the action units themselves. And I think that the reason that we purified it into these action units has to do with the dropouts, but I'm not so sure, and I'd be really happy to have a rigorous explanation to why we got it. Okay, and by the way, the network is running, it is now operating in one of the labs at the Technion, looking at kids, and it appears that kids have much less richer vocabulary than adults when it has to do with expressions. So this is about expressions. Now let's exit the comfort of convolutions, and let me tell you that if I want to segment something, my life would have been much easier if I also have the geometry. So instead of just having the RGB image, assume that I also have the distance of each and every point from the camera. In order to do so, when I came to the Technion, the first thing I did is build this stereo system that takes images of the world. So think about it as two eyes, and each eye is basically a different projection of the world onto the brain. And the brain is doing the fusion, trying to figure out which point on the right eye fits to a point on the left eye. In fact, what I have here is one of the eyes is in fact a projector. So the life of finding the correspondence become much easier. And this is how the geometry looks like. Now you think of, okay, you have the geometry, you solve the problem, and let me tell you that this is just the beginning of the problem. So what we did about 10 years ago is started up a company. It was called InVision by one of the graduate students at the Technion, Sagi Ben Moshe, with two of my students, Alex and Michael Bronstein. You probably heard about them. So we started the company and we sold it to Intel. And in fact, most of RealSense in Intel right now is based on things that we built in the lab 2 decades ago. So evolutionary, this is how it looked like when we start selling that. So this is the first sensor. This is compared to the US currency, and this is compared to Nevada currency. This is, by the way, Muli Eden. He was the CEO of Intel in Israel at the time. This is how it looks like. There is a camera, there is a projector, more or less like the projector that you have seen before. There is another RGB camera, which is calibrated with the rest. And I think that now Intel is in fact profitable selling these kind of features. If you like, you can buy, it's called RealSense sensors. There is a family of them. The new one, this is compared at the time to the Kinect. And this is how the size of the Kinect at the time was. There was a lot of energy. The optics was great. Now, let me tell you something. The moment you squeeze the optics into 3.2 millimeters, you get rid of all the beautiful accuracy that you had before. And now you have to compensate for that. And what better way to compensate would be neural networks. But before we did, at the end of the lecture, I will show you how neural networks, in fact, I don't think that I will show you, but let me tell you that neural networks can actually compensate for the lack of accuracy. But before that, what we did is use a very simple way of looking at image formation. And again, when we work on these problems in the university, we optimize for accuracy and time. When you push it to the industry, the most important parameter is the cost of this kind of tools. Okay, so we gave it to Intel, and now the question is, what should we do with crappy data that it produced, because they force us to shrink it into 3.2 millimeters. And what you see here at the top is the output of the RealSense camera. Again, what you see here at the top is the output of the RealSense camera, and this is my hand, and it is really lousy. And what I wanted to do is improve this data. Now, in order to reconstruct this data, we used only the projection and the gray level image that we capture by projecting a set of lines. We didn't use the RGB image. Why shouldn't we use the RGB image? We know that there is a very nice image formation model that tells us that each and every pixel is proportional to the inner product between the light source direction and the normal. So if we apply our knowledge of what is known as shading image, in fact, and this is an explicit way, in fact, what you can do is you can see, for example, the lines of life here in my hand, or before I couldn't. This is, by the way, colors here define the normals. So this is how it looks like after the improvement by just using a shading image formation model. And the same goes for the dwarf here. So the Smurfs here, you can see that you can actually see the smile on the face of this doll. Okay, so you can use a very simple image formation model in order to reconstruct the shape. And if you know an image formation model, what we call axiomatic ones, you can now train a network in order to get better results. At the end of the lecture, I will show you how we can do it for reconstructing faces from a single image. This is another, let me see if I can remove the voice here. What you see here is our sensor, the Intel sensor that is looking at this guy. And in real time, you can see an avatar that is moving. This is due to a company that is called Phaseshift, a Swiss company. It was acquired by Apple about 5 years ago and vanished. So it happens. And this is the new sensor of Intel. Let me tell you that the technology here is completely different. If before we always had stereo, either two images or a projector in an image, here what we have is called the LiDAR. In fact, it's an idea that I had many years ago, and I tried to sell it to several companies. Eventually, Intel produces it. And there is also a version for cars. It is now being promoted under the, how is it called, the Mobileye company. So you can actually get a sensor like that. In fact, we have one in the lab. If you want to play with it, be my guest. And it's really accurate, and it's much better than those that we had before. Okay, so we have a 3D sensor. What can we do with that? The first project that we had is working with a guy called Israel Amirav. He's a physician, pediatrician, and he told me, look, we are using face masks for babies, and usually they don't really seal the face of the baby, and they are really not comfortable. Can you scan a lot of babies and then train and then tell me what would be the optimal shape of a mask? So we gave him our sensor, the accurate one, and he went out to the fields and scanned about 400 babies, faces of 400 babies, and then we clustered them using the machinery that I will mention in a while. And then we gave him a design for something that is now called pseudomask, and Israel is a clever guy. He also introduced a hole for a pacifier, okay? And this comes down the baby and also create a better sealing effect. And now this was the design, and this is how the new masks look like. And we also checked them, and now they are selling them, and it's really popular. I mean, kids that hate these kind of masks because they're not comfortable and not fit for the face can choose one of 3 sizes and shapes of these kind of masks. Okay, so we know how to do something with this kind of 3-dimensional sensors. The question then that we have been confronted, I would say, during the last 15 years is what can we do when we have non-regular samples of data? So an image is a regular sampling of data. You have X, Y, and the sampling is more or less regular. You have for each point, you have a value. And then you can argue that convolution is a natural way of processing this kind of data. Geometric data is exactly the opposite. You have this kind of structure, and then we can argue how do you hold this structure as either a cloud of points, triangulated soup, triangulated mesh, some approximation of this data, but it would never be a natural way to feed it into a convolution neural network unless you compromise somehow, unless you think of this geometric structure as, for example, a graph of a function. If you do that, then you compromise, then you throw away part of your data. And the question is, how can you feed networks with this kind of data? So for that, we'll go back a couple of years back to René Descartes. If you're familiar with Cartesian coordinate, he's the guy that invented that. He is also the guy who claimed that I think, therefore I am. And let me look at the first thing that comes in mind. Assume that I have two shapes in the plane. Okay, so I have these two sharks, and I would like to ask whether they are the same. What I do is I can travel along the boundary of the shark, okay, of this two-dimensional, of this spot on the plane, and I can plot the radius of the osculating circle at each and every point. So think about taking 3 points and fitting a circle to them, and then plotting 1 over the radius of the circle, and I get a graph. So if I do it for these two sharks, I would probably get 2 corresponding graphs. But there is only one problem. I don't know where to start. And the question is, can I train a network to compute this kind of a graph? Can I train a network to find what we know from something which is called differential geometry, which tells me, look, if you travel along this boundary with constant speed, this is called the Euclidean arc length, and you compute the acceleration magnitude at each and every point, which is called the curvature, or the curvature vector, and you plot them one with respect to the other, then you get a signature of the object. Can I do that by learning? And in fact, you can. And this is a work by Gautam Pai, a PhD student of mine. I mean, he's now a doctor. He's now in École Polytechnique in Paris, doing his postdoctoral part. And what he showed is that if you do the computation for each and every point along this curve, then you get something that looks like the Euclidean curvature. I mean, he doesn't train it to be Euclidean curvature. He's just training it to be invariant to rotations and translations in the plane. So you got something. Obviously, he did a lot of mistakes, and now there is a new student, Roy, who can actually do much better. And in fact, he wasn't able to compute the arc length because of various non-objective reasons, and Roy can compute the arc length. But in the plane, for one-dimensional curves, feeding this idea into a convolution network sounds, let me say, a natural way to go. Okay, it would be almost trivial way to go, because you can use a fully connected network, always feed just 3, 4, 5, 20 points, and you're done with the problem. The question is what happens in 2D, for example, when you have many points, a much higher dimensional space. To that end, let me do a bypass and tell you about a mathematician who published papers under the name of Lewis Carroll. For example, Alice in Wonderland. And in his book, Alice in Wonderland, when Alice is drinking the forbidden potion, she's going through something which is called affine transformation. So she's being stretched along one axis. And then she feels that something strange is going on. I mean, this is an intrinsic property. She can actually see that her hands are actually being elongated along the single axis. When Walt Disney took this problem upon himself, he preferred to keep Alice as being as beautiful as she was at the beginning. So when she drinks the forbidden potion, she scales down uniformly. Okay, this is called uniform scaling. And in order to see that something strange is happening, he had to put her in some embedding space so that she would see that something strange is happening. At the same token, the whole world could have expanded without anything special happening to her. Okay, and then she eats the cookie and so again, in order for us to see that something strange is happening, he had to put Alice in this house so that when she's growing, when she's scaling up, the bunny has to run for his life, the rabbit has to run for his life, because the Lang is popping through the door. And you can see that this is the difference between what we call affine transformations and uniform scaling. So uniform scaling is a special way of defining affine transformations. And the question is, can we define measures that would be invariant to this kind of transformations? Okay, that would be invariant to scale and would be invariant to affine transformations. So assume that I have these two roads along which I can travel, and I would like to define an arc length that would be invariant to scale. Do you have any ideas of how can I define an arc length that would not be just dx squared plus dy squared square root of? Any ideas from the audience? from the 8 audience? You're muted if you're... So think about driving a car along this road. What would be the invariant way of saying that I've reached this point and the corresponding point, that point? What do you do when you drive a car on a road? You have two ways of controlling your
like the angles of the curve.
Gal, thank you. So the angles, what you're actually doing is steering your wheel, okay? And the amount by which you're steering your wheel defines, if you integrate the amount by which you're steering your wheel, will define how far you went through this, along this curve, okay? So if we, so integrating over the change of the velocity vector, okay, so assume that I'm traveling with a constant speed along that guy and along that guy, and the constant speed is called ds. So the amount by which I'm rotating my my wheel is called d theta, and I can compute it by multiplying by 1 over the radius of the oscillating circle at each and every point by the arc length. Okay, so this is how I can get a scale invariant way of measuring distances along a curve. And this is well known, and people have used it for various problems in shape, in two-dimensional shape analysis. The question is, what can we do in 3D, in objects, in two-dimensional objects that are embedded in 3D? Before we get into that point, let me tell you a story about how to let me just tell you that we can use networks in order to compute distances between points on surfaces. So assume that this is surfaces, this is a two-dimensional surface, and I can compute the distances between each and every 2 points on the surface with a really, really accurate way. Okay, so there is a really accurate way of computing distances on the surfaces. The evolution was that on regular grids, you could compute things which were let's say h to the power of 3 accurate, which is relatively accurate, and it took about between 2 to 5 years between each and every steps along the way. In triangulated shapes, it took much more time, and in fact, we are stuck at h squared accuracy, which is in fact called exact algorithms because of various reasons, because they are exact on the polygon that approximates the surface. And the question that we ask ourselves is, can we have an algorithm that can compute exact distances on surfaces with linear complexity? So n is the number of points here, and h defines the accuracy, the distances of edges in my triangulated surface. And the question that we asked ourselves is, can we compute distances on surfaces with linear complexity, order of n complexity, or quasi-linear, so that they would be exact? And the answer was given by a student of mine, Moshe Lichtenstein, who was able to show that you can train a network to do that. In fact, very similar to what Gautam Pai was doing in his two-dimensional stuff. And he got really, really nice results. Best paper award in SSVM, Scale Space and Variational Method Conference. Really technical conference, and the competition there was really hard. And so assume that you can compute distances on surfaces. What does it help us? I mean, why do we need to compute distances on surfaces? In order to compare between two surfaces, what we have been doing for many years is treat surfaces as manifold. And let me tell you what is a manifold. If you think, for example, on the hand, on the surface of the hand, then it wouldn't really matter how I put my hand, how I pose my hand in 3D space. From a point of view of an insect that is asking what is the distance between these 2 points, it would always be more or less the same. So up to some small stretching and of the hand, the distance between these 2 points would always be the same. So this is a group of isometries that I would like to be invariant to. Okay, so I would like to find a distance that would tell me that these 2 hands are much, the distance between these 2 hands is much smaller than the distance between this hand and this kind of manifold, okay? And the way to do that is to sample the hand with many, many, many points. compute the distances between each and every 2 points. And now think about it as a graph. So I have Dij for this end, and I have another Dij for a glove. And now I'm trying to somehow permute all my points so that the Dijs would align. There would be the discrepancy between the intergeodesic distances, the interdistances would be as small as possible. If I can solve this problem, then I have solved the matching problem, and I've solved many problems in in a field which is called geometric processing. It appears that there is a way of measuring discrepancy between metric spaces. It is called the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, or the Gromov distance. Gromov is probably one of the best geometers that lives today. He got the Abel Award, which is the Nobel for mathematicians. It is much more important than the obviously the Turing Award, but also the Fields Award. It is given for a lifetime achievement rather than just an achievement up to the age of 40, like the Fields Award. And the Gromov-Hausdorff distance basically tell you, look, if you somehow try to find all possible assignments of all points from this metric space into this metric space, and find the one that would give you the minimal distortion, then this is a distance. This is a valid distance. And through the years, we have been busy trying to compute this kind or approximate this kind of a distance. We use something which is called multidimensional scaling, generalized multidimensional scaling, then doing it in a spectral domain. Gil Shammai did something embedding into complex spaces. We use principal component analysis, regularize the principal component analysis, use functional maps. You know what is functional maps. I will talk about functional map net in a while. And then GMDS net, which is basically functional map net, which can compute the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. And in fact, we had why did I call SF maps spectral functional maps net? Okay, so first of all, what is a manifold? The manifold is a topological structure. For example, a cup and a donut would have the same topological structure, or this shape and the sphere would have the same topological structure. But the moment we add distances to the manifold, things are becoming a little bit more interesting. For example, these two surfaces are called isometric. Okay, why they are isometric or almost isometric? Because distances, because I can match each point here to each point there, and I can claim something about the fact that the distances were not changed, if they were not changed. Okay, so this is the difference between Riemannian manifolds and manifolds in general. If I have a manifold, then I have a Laplacian operator in the manifold. I will not bore you with how you do that, but think about approximating the manifold with many, many, many points. And about each point, I can compute the relation between the points and between the point and its neighbors, and thereby I can compute something which is called a Laplace-Beltrami operator. So exactly in the same way as we did in the course, by decomposing the Laplace-Beltrami operator into its eigenfunctions that gave birth to the Fourier, I can take the surface harmonics, and this is how I do that. I take the Laplacian with respect to my definition of a metric, and I compute the eigenfunctions, the corresponding eigenfunctions. Now, I can look at the same surface in two different ways. I can use a regular metric, and I can use a scale invariant metric, for example, one by which I multiply by the Gaussian curvature the regular metric. Okay, and then I will get a different basis. It would still be optimal, but it would be optimal in representing functions, smooth functions, with respect to the scale invariant metric. Okay. Now, in the functional map idea, what we did is we took the inner product of eigenfunctions computed in one space with eigenfunctions computed in a different space, and it created something that we call the eigenfunction matrix. Here we can do it for the same surface. So using a different metric for the same surface and finding the inner product of these two eigenfunctions, I can compute an invariant matrix Cij that would serve as a signature for the surface itself. And now, rather than comparing between these smooth structures that I don't know how to compare with another smooth deforming structure, I have a fixed matrix that I can take the matrix of the first guy and the matrix of a second guy and trying just to compare the matrix. So in fact, what we did is we can translate, like exactly like the philosophy of Descartes, we can take and translate a continuous problem, a geometric problem, into an algebraic one of subtracting matrices. And this is in fact what we have been doing in my group for, I would say, almost even more than a decade. Now, how much time do I have? Let me tell you another story about how people have been comparing shapes in 3D space. So assume for a moment that I give up the flexibility and the non-rigidity of objects, and I would just like to compare rigid objects. What people have been doing for more than 100 years is looking at the moments of the points that describe, or the solid that described an object. So what are the moments? If I sum over all the x, y, and z points that describe this plane, what I would get as first order moment would be my center of mass. The second order moments, which is summing over all the x's squared, the y squares, the z squares, and all the combination, and then finding the PCA of this matrix would give me the main rotation axes of this object. Okay, so it would be more or less the main axis, and then the secondary axis, and then the third axis. And I can go on to further moments. And in fact, you can describe each and every rigid object by a set of these moments. What I basically do is I project my points onto the polynomials, the x, y, z, and then the higher order polynomials. So if we think of our betas in the course, so the betas would just be the polynomials, and in fact, you can actually make them orthogonal and orthonormal, and you can project your data onto this infinite orthonormal basis, and in fact you can truncate it after a while and you can represent the object. And people have been trying to recognize objects for many years using the moments. So this is how shapes were classified, I would say, up until 20 years ago. Now, recently, and when I say recently, I'm saying 3 years ago, there was a new comer to the game. It's called PointNet. PointNet is doing the following. It is taking each and every point, the coordinates of each and every point. So I get 3 numbers, x, y, and z, RGB, x, y, and z. And I have a fully connected network with a couple of sequences that lifts these 3-dimensional numbers into a 1,000-dimensional space. Okay? So I have fully connected, and then I have fully connected, and then I have fully connected. And the way that I train this network is to take a set of points, and then, okay, so each and every point produces a 1,000-dimensional point, okay? So if I started with 10,000 points, I end up with 10,000 points, but at the beginning they were in R3, and at the end they are in R1000, okay? Now, what do I do with 30,000 points in a 1,000-dimensional space? What PointNet was doing is then find the average or the maximum along each and every axis. Okay, so this is what it was doing. It was basically max pooling along each and every axis. So each and every shape like that got a vector or 1,000 number that was the indicator, that was the signature of this plane. Okay, so this is a sketch of what is going on. The network is getting a point, the coordinates of a point, produces a number in a 1,000-dimensional space, and it does it for all the points of the plane. And at the end of the day, each point is being represented by a 1,000-dimensional plane, and then you max pool, you find the point that has the maximal value for each and every point. Now, let's replace the max pooling by averaging, for example. So if I would average along each and every axis, I do something that has the smell, that looks like, that feels like, that has the flavor of moments, okay? So if this 1,000-dimensional vector would have x as the first coordinate, y as the second, z third, x square, y square, z square, x, y, etc., what I would do is basically lift the coordinates of a point into something that would be easier for my max pooling or my averaging process to produce the moments of. Okay. Now let me tell you something about neural networks. Neural networks are really good. They are excellent in convolving, in multiplying a given number by something which is fixed. It is really bad in multiplying two numbers. If you'd like to get two input numbers and multiply them, the number of layers that you will require for the network would be at least log the range of the numbers that you're observing. Okay. It's not a big number, but if you have now to take a cube or etc., then you have to take a really large number of layers in your network. And the question is, why shouldn't we help the network? And this is what Joseph Rivlin and Alon Zvirin in my lab were doing. What they were doing is asking, okay, instead of feeding the network with XYZ, why shouldn't we feed the network with 9 numbers? So rather than feeding it with just 3 numbers, now I feed it with 9 numbers. These 9 numbers would help the network to produce the moments if indeed this is what it is doing. And in fact, with a much smaller network, using exactly the same machinery, lifting into a 1,000-dimensional space, then max pooling, and then training the network in order to recognize rigid objects, it was able to perform much better. So again, this is the network, and it was obviously performing much better in terms of memory, so it required less numbers as well as computing time, and obviously it was much better in overall accuracy. Okay, so this is an interesting way of how to adopt our knowledge of what is going on in the real world into neural network, what is going on in axiomatic methods into neural network. Let me push this idea a little bit forward. Let me jump over that. This is a recent work, and this is why I like to present it. But let me talk about functional maps. Let me just mention that you can use this idea of point net. So here what we do, what Oshri Halimi and Ido Emanuel and others did is take the coordinates of a point, then they also took the normal at each and every point so that the point net would have a little bit more knowledge about what is going on, and they lifted it into a 1,000-dimensional space with and at the end of the day produced this 1,000-dimensional vector. Okay. Now what Oshri did is she took a whole shape and a partial shape in a different pose, and she trained a network to find 2,000 latent space, so that there is a decoder function that knows how to take the whole shape and partial and this embedding into this latent space and produce the shape in the new pose. So again, the input to the problem is a shape with partial data, as well as a full shape in a different pose. And the output of the network is a full object in the new pose. Okay, so assume that once somebody reconstructed your body in a perfect manner, and now you're moving in space, you can do in almost real time reconstruction of the body by using the full memory of the body in a different pose. Okay, using this idea of point net in an encoder-decoder fashion. And this is how it looks like. This is how Q was looking. This is how the partial was looking, and this is how the reconstructed shape was looking at the end. And this is how the ground truth was looking. Okay, so this is point net. Now functional maps. We talked about functional maps in the course. We have this S and we have this F, and we are if somebody is giving us the way of linking, of translating S to P, then we are really happy. But usually we would like to find this transformation function. And in the course, we have shown that if I have many functions that are producing these many coefficients alphas, then I can extract T by somehow computing this this dot product between the transformed size, which is the basis in this p-axis, and the psi, which are the basis in this S basis. Okay, so there is a way to compute this matrix C. Okay, and we can also do it for shapes. So if we can do it for axis, for one-dimensional space, we can also do it for shapes. We can take the Laplace-Beltrami operator, extract the eigenfunctions, project everything to the eigenfunctions, and then do exactly the same machinery, and then ask what would be the way of matching these two shapes. So again, if I have many functions like a body detector, a tail detector, a nose detector, I can find the coefficients of these functions in each and every basis, and then the functional map that relates the two shapes would be nothing but taking the coefficients in one and dividing them by the coefficients of the other. How can we design a network that would do that? And this is a nice work by Or Litani, a student of Alex Bernstein. And since I was not part of this effort, I'm telling you that I think this was a leap forward in the process of taking geometric problem and feeding them into networks. So what Or Litani was saying the following: take two shapes, X and Y. Okay, so I have two shapes. First of all, compute really really simple features. So there is a way of computing features. It is something like blowing up a sphere about each and every point and counting how much of each and every section of the sphere is intersecting with the surface. There is a group of Italians that had this idea of a shot. In a moment, we'll get rid of it, but this is how it started. So shot is a way of computing features on surfaces, but they are really bad features. And so if you assume that I have, I colored my surface. So I have my RGB, but now I have 300 colors. Okay, it would not be just RGB, but it would be R1, G1, etc. 1,000 of them, or 300 of them. In fact, it was 300 of them. So I have 300 colors for X, and I have 300 colors for Y. And if I was trying to just apply the functional map for them, I got really lousy reconstructions between matchings between these two shapes. I mean, it was terrible. So what Or was saying: train a neural network that would get these 300 numbers and would somehow mix them. Okay, he was cooking a new recipe so that the new features would be excellent for my matching problem. Okay, and then he was training a network that would do this new recipe, that would do this mixing. And for that, what he needed is to be able to say how each point in X would correspond to each point in Y, and he had to do it for many surfaces. So he had to have the correspondence between all points in X and all points in Y, and this was his penalty, and this is how he was weighing his penalty, and at the end of the day, this is how he was training the neural network. What Oshri Halimi, a PhD student of mine, was saying: look, this is a supervised way. It's really painful to find the correspondence between many. I mean, you don't have so many data, such a rich amount of data, that will tell you how points are related between two different shapes. Let's do the following. Let's assume that I'm looking for the permutation that would take all the interdistances on X to the interdistances on Y. Now, I know how to compute the interdistances on X and the interdistances of Y. I told you that there is a very efficient way of doing that. In fact, you can actually compute just a low rank approximation of this matrix, so you can do it in quasi-linear time and space, but assume that I'm working in the n-squared definition of all points to all points. So the penalty, the new penalty that Oshri injected into Or Litani's framework, into the functional network, is this unsupervised way of measuring, finding the correspondence between intergeodesic distances. She got even better, I mean, comparable results to the supervised version. This is the supervised and unsupervised before you refine it and after you refine it, and she got really nice results. And in fact, and it was also robust to missing parts. And the big surprise was that she was, I mean, this is how each color here shows that you can actually find the correspondence between matching points. And the big surprise is that you can actually fit two shapes to the network and train the network for the two specific shapes. I mean, you don't have to take a lot of shapes and then do whatever you do, but just take two shapes and train your network to find the best permutation of points for a specific set of shapes. And we had a little bit of a problem convincing the reviewers that this is something that we can do. Now, you should tell me whether you have enough energy to continue for about 20 minutes, or if you want to take a 10-minute break and then continue for 20 minutes. So shout. This is.
I think we can keep going.
Okay, so let's.
Unless someone else thinks.
So unanimously, we'll continue going. So let's continue. Now, I told you before that if you multiply the curvature by the Euclidean arc length, then you get a scale invariant way of measuring distances. Let me tell you that for surfaces, it's more or less the same. And if you multiply something which is called the metric coefficients, which is something that we haven't learned in this course, but it is basically a way of measuring distances on surfaces. If you multiply it by a quantity, which is a beautiful quantity, which is called the Gaussian curvature, then you get a scale invariant Laplacian. Okay, so this is Laplace and this is Beltrami, and it's called the Laplace-Beltrami operator. And this is Gauss, and this is Gauss and this is Beltrami, and this is Gauss and this is Laplace, as far as I remember. So one of them is this is Laplace. Now I need to think where this is. Which one is Beltrami? But you have all three of them here, more or less. Okay, if I look at the eigenfunctions of the Laplace-Beltrami operator, the regular one, this is how they would look like. So these would be our frequencies. So blue is high positive, red is high negative, and this is how they would look like. Obviously, the first one would be a constant, and then this is how they would look like. Okay, and you can see that the more I go to the higher eigenvalues, the higher the frequency. Now, if I modulate my metric with a Gaussian curvature, a similar phenomena would happen. But what would happen is that I would see the high frequency starting to appear where I have high curvature in a much more rapid way. So rather than waiting a lot of eigen values before start seeing the frequency appearing in the fingers, they would appear after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The seventh would start showing frequencies in the fingers. So now you can immediately see what the functional map would give you for the same surface. So if, for example, I'm taking the inner product between these two, each of these two eigenfunctions, what I would get is something that looks like that. So I'm computing the regular metric and the scale invariant one. Each one is producing a different set of eigenfunctions, and then the inner product would produce a matrix like that. And if I'm doing it for the same horse in many poses, what I would get is these kind of matrices, and for the lady, I would get a different kind of matrices. This is how Oshri got into the direct track for PhD. But here we were cheating a little bit. Why were we cheating? If I go back, you would note that the eigenfunctions appear with ambiguity in sign. So it can either be the sign or minor sign. They would be as legitimate as you want as being the composition of this operator. And even worse than that, if I have two similar eigenvalues, then I can have local switches. I mean, I can have these local subspaces where things are mixing up, and I have to resolve that. So what Oshri realized that if you take up to 7 eigenvectors, then you can control everything that is going on, and still you can separate quite effectively all these shapes as well as all these shapes. I mean, this is embedding into three-dimensional space of subtracting these matrices from one another and then looking at the covariance matrix of the subtraction of each matrix from each matrix, and looking at the first eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And this is basically a planar embedding into a plane domain. So if and each of these points correspond to this shape in a different pose. Okay, so what you can see is that using this trick, we can actually cluster or classify each of these objects. Here I have a little bit of balagan, but still we can do that. Okay, so it works up to a point. But going back to the Litani's idea of feeding shots into a neural network, we really hated this idea. But now we have these new features. Okay, they are bad because there can be some ambiguities, but we have these new features, much more, how would I say it, natural way of extracting features from the same shape. So how can we correct our network so that instead of shot, what we will do is feed into the network the eigenfunctions of the scaling invariant operator. Okay, so I would like to get rid of this part. And this is indeed what Amit Bracha, together with Ushul Halimi, did. So what Amit did is the following. He takes X, he takes the regular metric and the scaling invariant one. For the first one, he extracts the Fourier for the regular one and the Fourier for the scaling invariant one. And he does the same for Y. But remember that there is some rotation. We call this matrix band-limited unitary matrix. So there is some correction between these two scale invariant features that he needs to compensate for. So what it does is using the same network machinery, it's called the functional map network, in order to optimize for these rotations. So he gets two shapes, X and Y, and he optimizes the relative rotation of these subspaces, and then he gets the permutation between X and Y. Now, this is a neural network optimization technique, but it's not a neural network. At the end of the day, the only thing that is happening here is a linear multiplication of a matrix by this basis, and at the end of the day, he is getting a permutation. So the optimization happens for each and every couple of shapes, but at the end of the day, and it is done in a backpropagation manner and all the nice thing that you may have learned in your deep learning courses, or you will learn in your deep learning courses. But at the end of the day, what is going on here is that this is a pure minimization problem. So this is how the eigenfunctions were looking before application of this R. So you can see that the colors are different. And this is after, and you can see that after the colors correspond to one another. And obviously, if it works for 3, it would work for all of them. Okay. Before I finish, some papers from the recent 4 years. So about 4 years ago, a student that took one of my courses, Elad Richardson, was trying to reconstruct faces, the geometry of faces from 2-dimensional images. Now, if I would have had a lot of faces and the geometries, I could have done great. I could have trained a network, a convolutional neural network, and everybody would have been really happy. UNet, PixNet, whatever you like, you just have to take your huge amount of data, train the network, and everybody would have been happy. But there is none. I mean, nobody is giving me this kind of data. I mean, now I'm trying to compute this kind of data. In fact, in England, there are groups that have been computing 10,000 of faces, and in other places as well. We didn't have that. What we did have from Ran Brower's project, we had faces, and there are geometries, about 400 or 500 of them. So what we did for that is we used something which is called 3DMM, three-dimensional morphable model, and this is basically computing the PCA for faces by aligning them. First of all, taking these 500 faces and aligning them so that each and every point, which is the tip of the nose, would correspond to all of them. And the same would go for the lips, etc., etc. So once you aligned all of them, and this is the centering idea in PCA, then you can do PCA for the color, for the red, green, and blue, as well as for the X, Y, and Z. If you do that, and now you just randomly pick numbers from these coefficients for the PCA vectors, what you can do is synthesize geometries and photometries. So you can synthesize RGBs that correspond to faces as well as X, Y, and Z. And this is how these faces look like. Now, since we are sampling a linear space, this is how the faces look like. All of them look like as if they are after a stroke or severe coronavirus effect. But we get for free also the geometry, which is also synthesized from this huge amount of data. So we have these two by which we can now train a network. So now we can synthesize these objects. This is just traveling in the PCA space by just picking the coefficients. So we just picked up 300 coefficients for the XYZ, 300 coefficients for the color. And now you can actually take each and every of these faces and also rotate it in 3D space. And you can also play with the color because you can render it whatever you like. And obviously we picked some random backgrounds from the web, and this is enough data to train a convolution neural network. So now we took a face from the web, we feed it into our CNN, and I will not comment about the structure of the CNN. It's more or less a classical one. And the output is something like that. I wish that by starting with a linear model, I could get a model like that. I get something which is really, 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 really smooth. Why? Because the linear model throws away the high frequencies. And the question is, how can I push back the high frequencies? And the answer was at the beginning of this lecture. So at the beginning of this lecture, I told you that there is this dot product, inner product between the light source direction and the normal of the surface that you can use in order to extract back the geometry of the surface. So what we did initially, this is the shape that you get by feeding the network and extracting the 300 numbers. So the network was trained to extract the 300 numbers, the 300 PCA coefficients of the 3DMM. This is a Vetter and Blunt's algorithm. And then what we did is reconstruct back the surface itself by projecting onto the eigenfunctions of the PCA. And this is what we got. It is a really smooth version of Leonardo DiCaprio. In order to push back all the high frequencies, what we had to do is work with the shapeform shading idea, this idea that I told you before, and this was an axiomatic way. Okay, this had to do with just running the algorithm of Roy-Yorel in order to extract back the geometry. So this was the first paper that we published in ICCV, sorry, in 3DV. The second one was asking, look, if we have an axiomatic way of computing, of refining the data, why shouldn't we train a network to do the job? So this was the second phase, and this is something that we published in CVPR. And we got really nice results. I mean, I don't know. And the third one was saying, why shouldn't we pass through an intermediate linear space? Let's just train the whole network end to end, pixel to pixel. And these are the best results that we got, and this is how they look like. So this is how an image looks, an input image looks like, and this is how the geometry that the network is producing. And look, you can see actually the wrinkles up to a sub-millimeter accuracy. Now, obviously, this is just an hallucination. I mean, I cannot really look at a two-dimensional object and claim that this is what I'm seeing. But from a network optimization point of view, this would be the best reconstruction that I see. So obviously, when somebody is putting makeup, the reconstructed image would look different. Okay, so you can fool this kind of a network, but still, I think it's a really cool network. And even today, there is some balance between accuracy of reconstruction and robustness. And what people have been doing is playing with the robustness, and where, for example, if you have a beard, then obviously our network would fail. And they were showing that when you put glasses and when there is a beard, the network would fail. My claim is that this would not be I mean, this is still one of the leading results in this field, even 4 years. And in this rapid way of evolving neural networks, this is an achievement. So again, 3 papers by Richardson and Sela, which I think are amazing. Now, let's go back to the basics. Remember that we started with a PCA, Principal Component Analysis way of reconstructing surfaces. And the question is, what would happen if I now train a network, and in this case, a GAN, to synthesize faces, okay? So for that, I need a lot of data, and this is indeed something that we now have. And we train a neural network using generative adversarial network, Guns and Roses, in order to do that. And we can actually also inject expressions to the game. This is a work by Gil Shammai and Ron Schlossberg. And this is how the output, so none of these shapes, as well as the geometries, are real. Okay, these are synthesized images. Okay, and they look quite realistic, no longer with the with suffering with all the effects of a linear model. And if we now look at real faces, okay, so what you see here are each point is a real face, and the distances between points are distances between a face recognition algorithm that produces a vector. So the distances are the distances between these vectors, and what you see is, roughly speaking, 3 populations, probably Asian, Caucasians, and Afro-Americans. And within each population, you can roughly see genders, I mean, female and male, and whatever. And you can see that the GAN, the synthesized GAN faces, are more or less capture the same statistical behavior as the real faces. However, when we look at the 3DMM, at the linear model, and we randomly, using Gaussian distribution, picking up numbers from these distributions, then most of the faces would be marriages between Afro-American, Asian, and Caucasian. And you could see that this is obviously not the distribution of the population. I don't know if it's good or bad, but this is what the linear models are providing, and this is what the networks is providing. So you can see that when you add nonlinearity to your processes rather than the PCA, then you can get much, much better results, better in the sense of mimicking, of being similar to the statistics of the data. This is how it works. It basically, what they did is basically took an NVIDIA way of reproducing, of synthesizing images and feeding the geometry into the same network, and the network could produce the geometry as well as the photometry. I think this is more or less it. I'll be happy to take questions either about this lecture or the course. And I see that all participants have survived my lecture, so I feel good. So questions. If and when you get to the faculty, to the department, and you will go to the parking lot, you will see these graffitis that I did with my daughter. And here, this is the D. Gromov-Hausdorff and the Laplace-Beltrami operator operating on the surface. So you would be one of the few that can actually understand what is going on here. So again, this is the Gromov-Hausdorff distance between surface S and surface Q, and this is the Laplace-Beltrami operator that is working on the surface S. And then, by the way, the Laplace-Beltrami operator operating on the surface is nothing but something which is called the mean curvature vector, just that you know, if you by any chance take my advanced course.
I have a question.
Sure, Barak.
In some of the results you showed, you used the projection to a greater space,
larger,
with a higher dimension.
Yes.
Why?
Okay, so let me, first of all, excellent question, as always. Let me try to explain it. So let me just stop share here and start sharing here. Okay, so you're saying the following. I have a space, I have some shape, and I'm taking points from this shape, and these points are actually, each and every point is a point in R3. And now the neural network, let's call it some function f, some function g, is taking this point, this point, and now embedding it into R1024. Okay, this was the question. Why do I use this high dimensional latent space? The reason is that the way that the point net is being constructed is that it takes each and every point, embed it into a 1000-dimensional space. So each and every point now becomes a vector. And now what it does is somehow average each and every entry in this vector. So either by max pooling. So at the end of the day, this whole shape would be translated into just a 1000-dimensional vector. Okay. So the process of first lifting and then shrinking is important. Now, why is it important? If you think of the philosophy, and again, I asked when I looked at this problem, I asked myself exactly the same problem. Why should I go through all this trouble of first of all lifting and then shrinking? If you think of what we do with Fourier, this is more or less the case. We take our function, and then when I do convolution, I basically take my function and I do the inner product with one of my eigenfunctions, but which at the end of the day would just give me one entry here. But the process of convolving, the process of doing the inner product is basically lifting the inner product with all this, is basically lifting it into this high dimensional space, where all the points are basically capturing one axis in this space. So I look at it as the first one representing all the x's, the second one all the y's, the next one all the z's, and then xy, etc., etc. So if I want to lift my surface into the set of polynomials, so you can think of having, let's think of one dimension. You can think of doing just the x. So the x would be values that are varying from 0 to, I don't know, to 100 here. So you can think about it as some function that embeds your R3 domain. And when it hits each of these points, it produces a number here. Okay. Then you have y. So y would be 0 here and 1 here. And this would be some function that is defined over all this domain. And the y would, whenever it hits a point, it would push a value here. Okay. And you can think about the rest of them. Now, your question is legitimate. Why shouldn't I somehow link all the points together so that they would somehow be reduced into a 1000-dimensional vector? Okay, and my question to you is, here I have 100k points. How would you do it with a network? Remember that here the network, the neural network, the function of the neural network is taking 3 points into 1000 points. This is something that a network can do. Taking 10,000 points, which do not have any sensible order. There is no regular way of looking at them, and embedding them into a 1000-dimensional space is problematic. Now, you probably, you're Alex's student, so you probably know about all the WL and the KW. Are you familiar with that, or am I
Not me.
I see. You're not Alex student?
No.
Alex Morrison? No, for some reason I thought you are.
Not yet first.
I see. So if you think so rather than looking locally at the Laplacian and either going through spectral domain using, for example, FM or FMNet, or going through this point net space, there have been other solutions to the problem. So in the pointnet, for example, rather than just looking at the points, you can look at the points and their neighborhoods, and you can look at the points and the normals at each and every point. But more or less, it's a way of enriching the local behavior of the pointnet philosophy. And the pointnet philosophy is stupid on one hand, but very clever at the other. The same, by the way, goes for the FMNet. It's a way of somehow reducing the dimensionality, the high dimensionality of your given data, 10,000 dimensional data, into a space where you can work with. And the operator that link between them is nothing but the Laplace-Beltrami operator. But you can think of other operators. And for example, there is this philosophy of how could I find the matching between two graphs. And the idea is this iterative coloring. And the iterative coloring is basically an operator that you apply iteratively on your graph. And this operator can be thought of as some way of extending the Laplacian. Okay, so you can think of applying the Laplacian, replacing the Laplacian by a different operator and then working with this operator. And then you have this kind of a structure that you can fit into a neural network. So the question is fundamental, and this is an active research today. My interest is in graphical objects, which are basically embedded in R3. So my life is easier in a sense. But if you think on a general graph idea, so you have a general graph idea, and the graph is something that you as computer scientists should be familiar working with. The graph, in fact, embeds a metric of itself on the problem that you are working with. And the question is how to fit graphs into neural network is something that Michael Bronstein has been busy working, I would say, for the last 7 years. And soon he would have a book about it, and it's called Graphic, and he sold his company to Twitter using that. And the idea is to use something similar to Laplacian and define these local symmetries on your graph, and thereby feeding them into using some sort of redundancy, exactly like we do with the convolution, and define it in the neural network. So again, I'm not saying that this lecture would give you the answer for that, but it would at least give you a flavor of the problem that you have to deal with. You no longer have this nice property of linear shift invariant, which is something that CNN is exploiting all over the place. The big success of CNN is exactly that. Convolution in time, convolution in space, convolution in time and space. And by the way, let me give you a trivial way of dealing with surfaces that could apply CNN. Somebody has any idea of how to take my hand here? So this is my hand. It's a two-dimensional manifold in R3. How could I apply a CNN in order to learn how these hands look like? Process them. You have any idea? Any idea where I can use convolution on this geometric structure?
In what way?
Again?
In what way do you want to?
I want to define a convolutional network that would treat this data in a sense that it would be able to denoise it, to compare it, to ask questions about it, whatever neural networks are doing with geometric structures. Let me also simplify things and tell you that there is a well-defined inside and outside this object, okay? This is a hint. So somebody can tell me what is a point inside the object and what is a point outside the object. Let's start with the two-dimensional.
You can project it down to a two-dimensional space. If you know what is inside, what is outside, you can place a seam over the object and fold it over a
Sean, take to your idea one dimension up. Why do I need to project? So what Sean was proposing was the following. I have my object, and now I would look at the projection of this object onto this part, and I would look at the projection of the object onto this part and onto that part, and I have this projection of this object into many images. And images is something that I can fit into a CNN, okay? And CNN is this kind of looking over the image and moving with this the same kernel or the same structure over the image, and everybody's happy. But CNN is not restricted to work in 2D. CNN can work in 3D. So I can think of an implicit representation of my surface. Think about it as psi that is smaller than 0 fxyz, that is smaller than 0 inside and is larger than 0 outside. And specifically think of a signed distance function. The reason I'm describing that is because it created a revolution in analyzing shapes. The moment you have an inside and outside, you can think of an implicit representation. It's Zug-Satum of your object. So this would be your object, and you know exactly what is inside and what is outside. It is defined by this function. And now you can have a CNN, which is a volumetric CNN. So it would be a 3D CNN. Convolution can be done in 3D. Obviously, you would have a much larger network, and you can argue whether it works or doesn't work. 3D works, okay? 3D is something that we can bear. And signed distance functions, or SDF, is something that I've been playing with, I would say, since 1995, without even knowing that it would be useful for networks. But now people are using signed distance functions in order to render shapes in graphics. So signed distance functions is yet another way of feeding this kind of geometric structures into networks. This would be inefficient relatively, but still it would use the redundancy of using the same operator all over the space. Now it would not be R2, my space, but it would rather be R3. This is something that I can still bear. The same operating over all RB or all R3, then I'm doing my max pooling and do it iteratively. So this is something that I could use, okay? So by the way, Sean, your idea of projecting the objects into images is something that people have been doing. In fact, competing with the PointNet, the best algorithm that were able to compute with the PointNet did exactly that, where they were projecting the object into these three-dimensional, into these two-dimensional images. You need many images like that, probably as much as points that you need in order to sample your R3 when you do implicit representation of your shapes. But it worked. It worked up to a point. I mean, it worked a little bit. It produces less inferior results compared to PointNet, but it was working. So again, a point for the idea. I assume that you didn't know about it before, so it is original and clever, and it was produced in the last 5 years. So again, but this is where the state of the art now is going on. And if we go into state of the art, there are reconstructing networks that are now working, in which, surprise, people have been replacing the ReLU. So this is what is usually defining the nonlinear part of a neural network. It is basically between a maximum between, if this would be my psi, maximum between psi and 0. Okay, so this is the transfer function of psi of a ReLU. This is how a ReLU is defined. So what people have been starting to do is basically introducing harmonics instead of the ReLUs. If you look into something which is called Cybran, and surprise, all the theoreticians that claim that ReLUs are the optimal way of doing something were embarrassed to see that if you project into harmonics, you get much better results, especially when we are talking about reconstruction. Okay, so those of you who would really be interested in looking in that, siren. This is something that was introduced by a group from Stanford last year. And again, the siren, the motivation for the siren was in fact coming from the sign distance function way of representing shapes. Since they are smooth, the idea was that the best way of capturing smooth functions would be with harmonics. Okay, and this can also be used in order to represent nonlinearities to the game. More questions? So the idea of lifting first into a high-dimensional space was clear, Barak?
Yes. So you needed like something like the moments features to extract from each point. Yes,
Yeah.
I think.
But by the way, most neural networks, first of all, lift. The moment you do convolution and you do several layers of convolution and then you pull them or you aggregate them, you start with an image of x by x, and your first layer would usually lift the data into a higher dimensional space. Then they would aggregate them. Okay, so this would often be the case. Not always, but often be the case.
The rationale is to try to separate the points in higher dimensions, so we can, in the higher dimension, project it to a better subspace.
So in this, the rationale, at least for me, is clear. The rationale between neural networks in general, the moment you try to assign rationality to the problem, immediately somebody is bypassing you and providing a non-rational explanation to a non-rational example to exactly the argument that you had. This was the issue with sparsity. This was the issue with the information bottlenecks. Whatever you do, take it with a grain of salt, because you can always train a different lookup table with a different structure that would do exactly the opposite of what your intuition goes, and would do a better way. You can show that overparameterization is good in many senses when you're trying to optimize and represent data. Okay, lifting into higher dimensions is good. For example, if we are trying to optimize, you have y, which is equal to w x, okay, and you are trying to minimize the argument is the matrix W, so that you're trying to optimize for that in some norm, I don't know, L2, for Benny's norm. Then it appears that if you take W and define it as W1 times W2 times W3, I mean, if you take your W and you represent it as a multiplication of matrices, then obviously you lifted the problem into something that you could have solved with a linear solver here and got. It appears that these kind of solutions behave better. They, especially when things are becoming a little bit more complicated, you can solve it more efficiently if you're using your gradient descent manner. So just this linear problem, when you lift it into overparameterization, is something. Now, if beyond that you have some structure here, and the structure, for example, is like saying that what I'm doing is moments. Okay, if you can also introduce some structure to your lifting, then immediately you're better than whatever was there before. Okay. So if we are done, then let me just see where everybody is. Good luck with your exam for the 5 that survived, and don't worry about it. It will be okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you for the semester.
Thank you.
Welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.
מאוד. תודה.
בשמחה.